So let's open it to the audience. There are roving microphones. There's just one housekeeping note. If you do have a question, could you stand so the cameras can pick you up and it can be broadcast online? Is there anyone out there who has got a first question? In the middle here with in the grey shirt. If you could just stand and say your name, your organization.
Hello, I'm Kevin Malseed from Inter Pares here in Ottawa. I'm sure you're aware that in some chronic refugee situations, I've seen this in various countries in Southeast Asia, for example, it can take a person up to 2 or 3 years just to get an interview with UNHCR for refugee status determination. And then if they do seek resettlement in a country like Canada, that can take a lot of additional time, and a lot of these countries are now basically cherry-picking refugees based more on their professional qualifications than on their vulnerability. So I find it's not surprising that we see an increase in people who see no other option but to try to get to countries like Australia or in Europe or Canada however they can and then claim asylum. So I'd be very interested to hear your thoughts on how the increasing trend that we see, for example, in Australia, that asylum seekers are mandatory detention, and in Canada, where now we have asylum seekers being denied basic health care since last year, and where sometimes the stated justifications for these policies are deliberately to make countries like Canada appear less welcoming to potential asylum seekers. So I'd appreciate hearing your thoughts on that. Thanks.
It's a very nice question. Thank you very much. Now, first of all, one of the challenges we face is that the UNHCR is still forced to do refugee status determination in more than 60 countries in the world. And as you can imagine, the resources to do it are limited. Our effort is to make states, especially middle-income states, and namely in the area that you mentioned, develop their own refugee status determination capacity, because it is an impossible challenge to be able to respond adequately to the needs in so many parts of the world, because it's a very labor-intensive process, as you can imagine. And so we have, indeed, in several countries, a backlog. Like in Canada, there was, until recently, a large backlog in relation to refugee status determination because of the difficulties in responding to, in having enough people to respond to the needs. So that is true. We recognize it. We are increasing our capacity, but the solution is not to have UNHCR doing refugee status determination, it's for states to assume that mission, because it's also part of national sovereignty. Second, the number of resettlement opportunities in the world, contrary to the idea that exists, has been increasing. When I joined UNHCR, we were referring about 40,000 people per year. We are now referring about 100,000, and 80,000 departures are taking place every year. So the number of resettlement opportunities is not decreasing. The problem is that the needs are enormous, and many people, of course, many people would need and deserve even more opportunities than that. Obviously, I have a lot of respect for all people trying to get to countries where they can have effective protection. Because in, for instance, many of the countries you mentioned in Southeast Asia, the effective protection does not exist. And I am very much supportive of these people, and I'm very strongly condemning the smugglers and the traffickers that do terrible violations of their human rights to use their desperate need for protection and to use it to the benefit of their own criminal organizations. So I think it makes sense for states to have measures against smuggling and trafficking. I think the right balance needs to be found in relation to fighting smuggling and trafficking, but allowing people in need of protection to have access to territories where they can find effective protection. And that is why, for instance, we have been very strongly against pushbacks of boats recently in the Mediterranean or in the southern Pacific, because we believe that we need to distinguish cracking down on smuggling and trafficking and the protection of the victims themselves.
Okay.
On the other side, just to finish, because I don't want to let, we have always been discussing with governments how to improve the support to asylum seekers and refugees. And in relation to Australia, one of the things that we have been criticizing is namely the extraterritorial processing of claims. And in relation to Canada, we were discussing yesterday with the minister how to improve the asylum system in Canada. We believe it's a solid asylum system. We believe there are some improvements that can be introduced. And the minister had the opportunity to tell us that in the evaluation that will take place at the adequate moment, he will be considering our own suggestions in order to see whether a system that is essentially solid, can have here or there things to be adjusted, how these things can be indeed improved.
Okay.
Namely, one of the things
we're going to
that
move on.
mentioned was related to
this
what
is as
you
bad
said
as a
about
story meeting. Hold on. We've got to keep going here. Now, I'd said to a fellow, yes, in the glasses with the mauve tie.
James Miller from Carleton University here in Ottawa. Mr. High Commissioner, welcome back to Canada. Thank you for your very thought-provoking talk. I found it quite striking the way that you linked the notion of pluralism and understandings of pluralism to the causes of forced migration that we're seeing right now in the Central African Republic and in South Sudan. But it prompted me to think how we might use pluralism as a way of thinking more creatively for situations facing refugees in countries of first asylum when it comes to providing protection and finding solutions. And given the experience of your office, how the experience of the protection of Somali refugees in Kenya being constrained because of particular understandings of inclusion and exclusion, or the factors that have led to a suspension of the naturalization of Burundian refugees in Tanzania, or the ethical dilemmas of resettling Lhotshampa refugees out of Nepal, where pluralism provides opportunities but also presents some constraints, how your office might use pluralism as a tool in seeking new opportunities for dialogues, not only with local communities, but also with states, on better protection for refugees and more timely solutions?
Well, the problem that you mentioned relates to a number of situations in which you have asylum countries that have been very generous opening their borders and received hundreds of thousands, if not millions of refugees, but that have limited the rights of those refugees in those countries, namely in some situations forcing them to live in camps, not allowing them to work or not allowing them to have another number of benefits. And the reason that usually is invoked is these are very poor countries, and that they consider that they have not the capacity to provide those things because they have high levels of unemployment, they have enormous economic problems by themselves, and they cannot open opportunities for the refugees themselves. What we try to do is two things. First, to convince them that self-reliance of refugees, contribution of refugees to their economy is a positive thing. And if we combine, I mentioned it, host communities and refugees in common programs, there is a way in which we have simultaneously pluralism, self-reliance and development for the country. But we have to recognize that for that to be possible, more meaningful international solidarity will be required. 86% of the world's refugees are in the developing world. And we have received a lot of support. Canada is one of our biggest donors and a growing donor in the recent years. But it's not only the question of supporting the refugees themselves. Humanitarian aid is the question of development aid to refugee hosting areas that are sometimes the most poor areas of the countries that receive them. And there, I must say, the international community has done very little, and it gives us little leverage to negotiate with governments the possibility of opening more rights for the refugees themselves. But what is true is that when it's possible to combine all the factors, refugees can give a very important contribution to the economic development of the countries themselves.
Thank you. Mark, I think I'd like to go to you, please, if I may, for a question from our online audience.
Thank you. High Commissioner, I have a question from online. In recent decades, there seems to have been a shift in public opinion in many developed countries against refugees and asylum seekers, often based on fear and misconceptions. Do democratic governments have a duty to abide by public opinion or to try and change it and confront the fear and misconceptions through education?
Sorry, I didn't hear the second part, and I couldn't locate you, so...
Sorry, I'm back here.
You said?
So in recent decades, there seems
the first part I heard. The second, I couldn't. I didn't understand.
Do democratic governments have a duty to abide by public opinion or to try and change it and confront the fear and misconception through education?
Well, you have two kinds of politicians. Politicians that follow public opinion and politicians that try to shape public opinion according to their convictions. My idea is that the politicians that follow public opinion usually do not have a big future because public opinion changes very quickly. And if politicians follow those changes, they will become not credible at all. My experience in government was that if politicians tell the truth about multiculturalism, about immigration, and about asylum, and if they show a clear principle-minded approach to those issues, public opinions tend to accept it. And I give you the example of my country. Portugal became a country of immigration in the 80s. Now, unfortunately, we are a country of emigration again because of the economic crisis. But in the 80s, we became a country of immigration. And we had a fertility index of 1.3. So without immigration, the country was condemned to unsustainability. And this was very clearly discussed, and mainstream parties assumed, center-right and center-left assumed that immigration was a positive thing and told it clearly to the public and discussed it clearly in public. And the funny thing is that we do not have in Portugal any party that uses xenophobia as an electoral tool because we managed altogether, parties of government and opposition, to unite our efforts together with the civil society to demonstrate that immigration was a good thing. And the same can apply about asylum. And what I said in my intervention is true. I mean, if you have an extremist party that says you need to close our borders, we need to send everybody out and whatever, and if a mainstream party tries to imitate it, to think that like that you limit the number of votes you will lose, it's a big mistake. Because people prefer the authentic version to the imitations. And when a mainstream party tries to imitate a radical party, in the end, it will be penalized. So I think the essential thing is to tell the truth, is to appeal for public opinion, to look rationally into things, and sooner or later, you will win. If you follow public opinion and you don't try to shape it based on your own values, sooner or later, I think you will be kicked out because people are not stupid and they understand where you are not sincere in what you say.
Okay, we have time for two questions. At the front here in the second row, the woman in the black. And the answers have to be short to get the two in or I'll be in trouble. The questions...
I have a very short question. I'm Romina Dalla from the University of Guelph, and I'm a business professor. So I just want to pick up on something that the moderator talked about in terms of is business involved or can they not get more engaged in this? Because it seems to me the solutions that we're trying to apply today are the same that there were 30 years ago. And isn't it perhaps time to look at a different solution that's not normative or aspirational, but something very concrete? Perhaps somebody from, some companies like Google could sit down and figure out, can we use technology somehow to solve the problem? So are you looking at something outside the normal way of sort of looking at collaboration?
Yes, we have now a network of innovation within UNHCR, and my deputy was recently in Southern California, where we have a network of companies that are working with us exactly in trying to find new approaches to address the problems of assistance and solution to refugees. Just to give you an example, today you can transfer money in Kenya through mobile phones. So, and I'm a strong supporter of cash grants to people in need instead of giving them things that we don't know if they want or not. I mean, the choice of people is always better than the choice of bureaucracies, as a principle. So, so there are lots of new things and new forms of activity in which technology can and is changing the way we do business. But I would like to say something about business that is very important. In the debate about migration, namely in Europe, I think Canada is not problematic in that regard, but in Europe, where the debate about migration is a very serious debate, businesses have been a very positive element in the debate, because businesses have understood that the sustainability of the European economy depends on migration. And so probably the most important role that businesses have in relation to the mobility of people and in relation to refugee protection, that is part of it, has been in the positions that business have assumed in favor of the movement of people as an element to also balance the global economy.
Okay, thank you. I'm sorry we can't get to everyone. There was one last question from the gentleman in the back with the glasses. I'm not sure if there's a microphone we can get to. Thank you. Just state your name and your organization.
Thank you. I'm Robert Young from the International Committee of the Red Cross. Good to see you again, Mr. High Commissioner. I was struck by your comments about asylum and the historic roots of asylum that, of course, predate the contemporary law. There's an obvious parallel with the work of the International Committee of the Red Cross. The law of armed conflict, humanitarian law, we say endlessly has roots that are historic, that span all of the great cultures and civilizations. But I think there's a parallel that's less inviting today in the 21st century, that the universal rules of asylum you've described to us are being forgotten. The universal rules of armed conflict, of humanitarian law, are being forgotten. Many of the contexts you mentioned, Syria, Central African Republic, it's precisely the lack of respect for these universal rules of humanitarian law that are leading to many people seeking asylum. How do we today, in the 21st century, with pluralism is a great, I think, agenda for this century, how do we harness pluralism to restore respect for these universal norms of humanitarian law, but also of asylum?
I think that pluralism is the key condition for universalism to be possible. I mean, there is no way to have universal rules if they are not perceived in the context of pluralist societies. But I would say that refugee law is more respected in today's world than international humanitarian law. With all the problems we face, borders of neighboring countries have been essentially opened in wars. I mean, look at the Syria neighbors, Lebanon, Jordan, Turkey. The borders are open. Look at the neighbors of Central African Republic, Cameroon, Chad, Democratic Republic of Congo, the borders are open. Looking at the borders of Somalia, again, Kenya, with all the problems, the border is open. Ethiopia, the border is open. So borders tend to be open, and refugee law tends to be respected. Where I see more dramatic violations is in what relates directly to your mandate, is international humanitarian law. All conflicts that we are witnessing today are seeing dramatic violations of international humanitarian law and are creating enormous restrictions to the possibility to deliver humanitarian aid to populations in distress. And that is why the situation of internally displaced people is sometimes more dramatic, I would say generally more dramatic than the situation of refugees. Because refugees at least are theoretically in a safe location and protected by another government. But internally displaced people are within the borders of their own country, and sometimes their own government is part of their problem, not part of their solution.
Thank you very much, everyone. That concludes the moderated session.